In the 1960s, Singapore was a small, resource-poor island struggling with unemployment, housing shortages, and a GDP lower than many African nations at the time. Today, it stands among the richest countries in the world, with a GDP per capita rivaling the United States, Switzerland, and Norway, despite having no oil, no land, and almost no natural resources. So, how does a nation with nothing transform into one of the world's most powerful financial hubs? The answer lies in a series of bold decisions, some controversial, some risky, and some remarkably ahead of their time. Welcome to Wallet on Fire, the channel where we break down how nations rise, fall, and rebuild their economies through policy, power, and innovation. Today, we're diving into the story of how Singapore rose from poverty to global prosperity. When Singapore separated from Malaysia in 1965, it was a nation that almost everyone predicted would fail. It lacked natural resources, arable land for food, freshwater supplies, a stable workforce, and a national identity. Unemployment sat above 10%, housing was overcrowded, and industrial development barely existed. The British military, responsible for nearly 20% of Singapore's economy, was preparing to withdraw, threatening economic collapse. Foreign nations didn't see Singapore as a potential economic miracle. They saw instability, ethnic tension, and vulnerability. Singapore's first Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, stated bluntly, "We were a country with no hinterland, no resources, and no reason for the world to pay attention to us." Yet that disadvantage became the foundation of its future strategy. Instead of trying to compete as a traditional manufacturing nation, Singapore embraced something revolutionary, becoming a strategic hub for global trade, finance, and logistics. The logic was simple. If Singapore lacked resources, it could become the gateway to those resources for countries that had them. This began with 3 pillars. 1. World-class port infrastructure. Singapore invested heavily in what would become one of the busiest ports on Earth, serving ships from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. 2. Free trade policies. Instead of protectionism, Singapore lowered tariffs and welcomed foreign goods. 3. Foreign investment attraction. Rather than building state-owned industries, it invited corporations like Shell, Exxon, and later tech giants to operate locally. This marked the start of Singapore as a global node rather than a local producer. Unlike many developing countries that relied on cheap labor, Singapore took a different path. Invest in education first, industrial growth second. The government expanded technical education, engineering programs, and vocational training centers. The result? Rapid industrial workforce growth, a foundation for advanced manufacturing, a pipeline for future high-skill sectors. This set the stage for Singapore's shift into electronics, pharmaceuticals, and later, biotech and AI. Singapore built a government that operated more like a corporation. Low corruption, predictable regulations, fast business approvals, strong property rights. While many nations suffered from corruption and bureaucratic delays, Singapore became one of the easiest places in the world to start and operate a business. This wasn't accidental. It was engineered through strict anti-corruption laws and high salaries for civil servants, reducing incentives for bribery. The slogan was clear: efficiency is economic power. A nation cannot grow if its population lives in unstable conditions. Singapore's response: state-organized mass housing through the HDB program. Within decades, slums disappeared, 90% homeownership rate emerged. Housing became a tool for social cohesion. This stability allowed Singapore to avoid the urban poverty cycles seen in many developing nations. Housing wasn't just shelter, it was economic policy. (1980s to 2000s). Once basic industry was secured, Singapore moved up the value chain. It transitioned into global financial hub, electronics and semiconductor manufacturing, medical technology and pharmaceuticals, data centers, and corporate headquarters. Keeping taxes low and regulations business-friendly, Singapore attracted Google, Meta, Apple, Citibank, JP Morgan, Pfizer. Companies didn't just operate there, they headquartered regional operations there. Today, finance contributes over 14% of GDP, and Singapore manages trillions in assets. Despite being small, Singapore invested heavily in military capability and diplomacy. Its strategy: be too valuable to threaten, too costly to destabilize, and too connected to isolate. This allowed it to sit between China and the West without choosing sides. Singapore's growth isn't without problems. Issue: explanation. High cost of living. Among world's most expensive cities. Growing wealth inequality. Billionaires versus lower-income migrants. Dependence on foreign labor. Significant share of workforce. Vulnerability to global trade slowdowns. Export-driven economy. The same policies that created prosperity also created pressure. Singapore is now shifting into artificial intelligence, climate tech, logistics automation, renewable energy imports, biomedical research. The goal is not to stay rich, but to avoid stagnation. Conclusion: Singapore is proof that a nation doesn't need size or natural resources to succeed. What it needs is strategy, discipline, and long-term planning. A poor island became a global powerhouse not by chance, but by design. Thanks for watching. You've been watching Wallet on Fire, where we break down how money shapes nations, people, and power. If you found this breakdown valuable, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next story of how economies rise and why some collapse.